Whether I enjoy my tea in solitude, amongst family, or with friends, I love the calming atmosphere it brings. But do you know where this drink has come from? How many wars were fought over it? And how many lives have changed because of it? Even today, we can see murky remnants of suffering and addiction. So let's chat about it. So I wanted to make this video because tea has always been a really near and dear part of my life. If my family can help it, they will always have their morning cup of masala cha. It's kind of like a chai tea latte that you could get from Starbucks, you know, like the black tea leaves are steeped in milk and then sweetened. But masala cha has an extra spicy kick to it because it has like added ginger, cardamom, all of the spicy flavors. But for this video, we're going to be talking about tea more broadly. And to do that, I want to give you a quick vocab lesson because tea has always had kind of the same two names. There's the Chinese word for tea called cha, and as tea came across the Silk Road to places like India, Turkey, Persia, they adopted slight variations of that word like chai. Some people even still call it cha, like my family does. And eventually, tea made its way to the Dutch, and they adopted the word tea or thee. So the words for tea have stayed relatively similar for the last hundreds of years, but the way that we make it has really changed a lot. Let's take our modern idea of tea. Taking your tea leaves and steeping it in a hot cup of milk or water. That's kind of what we're thinking, right? But it wasn't always like that. Now, people in Assam in India and the Sichuan and Yunnan provinces in China had been chewing on tea leaves for thousands of years before anyone really thought to put them in hot water and brew them. There's even a legend that the agricultural guru Shennong had been chewing on some tea leaves when he discovered their medicinal properties. There's also another legend that says that the same guy, Shennong, was boiling his water to make sure that it was safe to drink when a couple of tea leaves floated on in. And he was like, well, I don't want to waste it. He drank up only to discover, hey, it actually tastes pretty good. But like I said, these are all just legends, so we don't really know if that's true for sure. What we do know from recorded history is that in ancient China, the tea leaves would be boiled with ginger and onion to kind of make a soupy broth.
Good soup.
And it wasn't supposed to be yummy, it was supposed to cure physical ailments like headaches and tummy problems, sleepiness, that kind of stuff. And you know who really liked that this would take away that sleepiness from the day? Monks. The monks were so happy to find something to keep them awake through their long meditations that they carried it all throughout China with them. And eventually this spread to everyone, from peasants to the higher class citizens. Everyone wanted some tea. But when it got popular, people were like, hey, if it cures all these physical ailments, can we please make it taste better? So they got to work on it. They found new ways of cultivating and processing tea leaves that made it taste better. So this caused a boom in tea gardens and tea houses. People really loved their tea now. At this time, tea leaves were packed into these tight little bricks. You'd snap off a little piece and throw it in your hot water whenever you wanted some. And some people also ground up those tea leaves to make kind of like a powder. And that's where we got our modern idea of matcha. The tea got so popular amongst the upper class that they were like, hey, this stuff is pretty good. Let's export it. So they wanted that sweet, sweet cash. So unfortunately, peasants had to, on top of their other crops that they were responsible for growing, also grow tea crops to add as a tax or a tribute to the emperor. So now tea is getting popular in China, okay? So they're like, oh, let's export it. So they're getting it out to different countries in Asia. And the Asian countries are like, ooh, this tea stuff is so good, thank you. And it gets to Europe, and the Europeans are kind of having other opinions. A merchant tried tea in 1637 and said, cha, only water with a kind of boiled herb in it. Unimpressed. And that's kind of the general sentiment that most British people felt at this time. That is until King Charles II married Princess Catherine of Braganza. Catherine loved the stuff. She was a tea girly all the way. And here is where the British East India Company comes in. They were like, this is our chance to make more money. For the newlyweds' gift, the British East India Company gifts them a kilo of Chinese imported tea. They know Catherine loves it, so just a harmless gift, right? Well, Kat is like, oh hell yeah, I got some tea. She's happy. Now, since the tea was so wildly unpopular amongst the British commoners at this point. Nobody really batted a lash. They're like, okay, whatever, she likes her stuff. But since Catherine was going to be queen now, everyone wanted to do what the queen was doing in high society, and she was drinking her tea. So the other high society folks were like, where can I get me some of that? And Cat goes, I got it from the British East India Company as a gift. Y'all should go to them. So of course they fork over their cash, lining the pockets of this big corporation. Oh, and this story only gets worse. They were also called the Honorable East India Company, which is not true, to say the least. But that's coming up. All you need to know right now is that the British East India Company is like the only one who can trade with the East, right? They have a monopoly. They're hugely powerful. They can conquer huge amounts of land. They have a militia. They're kind of intense. They were kind of a-holes when it came to trading and conquering large amounts of land. But none of the Europeans cared about exploitation of the people in the East right now in the 1600s and 1700s. No. Right now, the British people were focused on absolutely loving the tea. At this point, tea was selling at 10 times the amount of coffee. The British East India Company was getting like a dummy amount of money by trading their silver for the tea and then selling that tea back to their people and, you know, other European countries as well. But they were like, you know, we could probably get even richer. And I like money. See, China was having a great time being the best exporter of tea. They were the only ones that could cultivate the tea and process it to be as tasty as everyone wanted it. Now, because they were so good at it, they would only let foreigners in at one port, and they only wanted cold, hard silver. Now, that was a lot of hoops for the East India Company to jump through. So the Honorable Company created a not so honorable plan. And your mind might not jump to get them hooked on drugs, but theirs did. See, China had used opium as a medicine for a very long time, but it's also a drug. So the East India Company is like, dude, let's get them hooked on this shit and then trade the tea for the opium that we sell them. This sounds like a plan that frat boys Chad, Thad, and Brad came up with, but it worked. Now remember, I said that the British East India Company was very powerful at this point. And it always comes back to colonialism with Britain. They were able to conquer large amounts of land. So to put their plan into full effect, they conquered parts of India. They were like, hey, this will be a great place to start growing some tea, maybe in the future, but it'll be a really wonderful place to grow a bunch of opium. Big brain energy. For the opium portion of their plan, they turned their attention to Bengal. Side note, Bengal was a booming industry at this time. It was India's biggest manufacturer of ships and textiles. Bengal's economy was pretty much larger than any of the ones in Europe at the time, so it's really shitty to know what the outcome was. Now, Bengal was leveled to grow opium. For what? To help the British East India Company get more money? More power? I know this is the case for a lot of places that are absorbed by colonialism, but I just wanted to highlight it here. 15 years after the British East India Company took over Bengal, 10 million Bengalis died of starvation. Let that sink in for a sec. Well, the scheme worked because when the opium was good enough to harvest, it was basically shoved down China's throat. And this led to 1 out of every 3 Chinese people being addicted to opium. And it was illegal at this point. But the people were like, I don't fucking care. It's here. I'm gonna have it. Meanwhile, the British East India Company took home $3 billion annually. And it only increased from there. Opium was ravaging the Chinese people and their economy. So in 1839, the Chinese emperor was like, oh my god, what the fuck? Everyone is hooked on drugs. And he sent an official down to the port that the foreigners could trade at. And this official and his men waited until they caught the British East India Company red-handed with 1.2 million kilos of opium. And the official ordered his men to dump all of this opium in the ocean. But the British threw a fit, an absolute meltdown, because they started opening fire on the Chinese for not letting them sell illegal products to their citizens. Like, what? Can you make it make sense, please? This started the Opium War from 1839 to 1842. But it wasn't really a fair fight. All of these Chinese citizens were addicted to opium, so it's not like they were in mint condition to fight or anything, right? So the Chinese emperor had to humiliatingly surrender and negotiate. In this negotiation, they paid for the whole ass cost of the war. The money that was lost from the opium being dumped into the sea, gave Britain Hong Kong, and opened up 4 other ports to the British. And there was another opium war later too. That sweetened the deal for the British even more. But let's get back to the tea trade. So the British East India Company is like, oh, thank God, our plan worked. Let's go. But you know how I said that they were trying to grow tea in India? That was not really going so well. And they were like, okay, we got China to trade some other stuff other than silver for their tea, but we want our own tea. But we want to make it for really cheap and we want to sell it for really expensive. So we need to learn how to make the tea really good. Like, they knew how to grow some tea at this point, but they just didn't know how to process it and prepare it to taste as good as the Chinese tea did. Like, the tea that the British East India Company was growing in Assam in India just didn't taste as good as China's tea. And they were like, why? They realized one aspect of it was that the climate was just not similar to the really great places in China that were growing the best teas. So they're like, okay, where is similar to the places that are growing this really yummy tea in China? And they find out that the Himalayas were pretty similar. So they're like, check. Okay, we got one thing figured out. So now these little fools just need to steal some of the really good tea plants from China and bring it over to the Himalayas and grow it there. They're thinking, hey, this is gonna help us expand our tea trade. But China was really strict about holding their tea secrets. They were the largest exporter of tea in the world at this point, after all. They don't want to share any of their secrets. Like, a Chinese citizen could not trade plants with a foreigner. They could not talk about like how to cultivate a plant with a foreigner. You know, it would really just be best if they just didn't even look at or talk to a foreigner. So the East India Company is like, oh shit, no one's talking to us. We need a spy. They need the tea version of James Bond. Their choice was British botanist Robert Fortune. He went to China in 1848 to steal all these tea-making secrets. Now you'd think that maybe he needs to like get to know someone and, you know, like get in there on the DL and stuff. But no, he just wore traditional clothing that Chinese people would wear at this time and then like walked right in. Surprised that nobody did this before 1848, but it is what it is. But he learned a lot, okay? He learned that the black tea was the same tea leaves as the green, but just fermented. And this was a big deal because Britain didn't know this at the time. They were like, oh, this is news to us. We thought that they were all different kinds of tea leaves because different teas taste different, so that means it's different. But this guy understood the assignment, okay? He stayed in China for years. He sent back a bunch of really great tea plants, and he also convinced a bunch of master tea makers to come back to India with him to make tea for the British East India Company. And here's where we get into more exploitation. So the British learned these secrets and started outproducing China with the use of Indian slaves. Quick correction, just to say that these folks were actually indentured servants, but they were still treated pretty similarly to slaves. And as the industry boomed, Indian slaves were taken from their homes and forced to relocate without any warning. They had to endure really harsh conditions and mistreatment too. People were beaten, not given enough food, not even given sanitary conditions to live in, and the kids didn't get out of it. They were forced to work too. It's sad because it really hasn't changed much today. While the people working on these tea plantations aren't necessarily slaves, they still have to endure grueling work and really, really low wages. Assam in India is the highest tea producing state in the country, but it's also one of the poorest. Big brands who own the plantations take up to 95% of the profit. This woman interviewed from the BBC said she hadn't had a working toilet in 36 years. And the kicker is Indian laws say that the plantation owners need to provide a safe, clean home with a working toilet. That's the bare minimum. And they can't even do that. Tell me why this woman had to tell the interviewer that since she doesn't have a toilet in her home that works, she has to go on the tea leaves sometimes. And I'm sure she's not the only one. Do you really want that on the products that you're consuming? I'm in no way saying it's her fault. It's the fault of the giant corporations like Lipton, PG Tips, Twinings Tea, Tetley. Yeah, those are the corporations that are putting people through this. And they're only a few of the companies responsible for these human rights violations. And it's not only the toilet situation either. Interviewers have come to look at the living conditions of these folks, and they find that there's broken roofing, walls that are moldy, toilets that are becoming water damaged, so the sewage is coming too close to their drinking water and probably mixing in it. And the plantation managers say they don't have enough money to fix this. Gee, I wonder why they only have 5% of the profit to work with. And before you click off the video, if you listen to any part of it, please listen to this. Please stop supporting these brands. I know it's hard to ask people to donate money to an organization that they know nothing about. So I'm linking a free resource in this video from The Ethical Consumer. If you found the information that I told you to be alarming, then this is something that you could do for free. Change what you're drinking if you like tea. Find things that are fair trade or ethically sourced and buy that instead of your normal Lipton or Tetley tea. And if you don't want to look at that, then I will tell you right now to avoid Twinings Tea at all costs. They got a 0 out of 20 on the Ethical Consumer Guide. That means they don't give a shit about human lives, the environment, what you're consuming. So probably don't drink their tea. I know times are tough for everyone right now, so please, at the very least, just check out the free resource. And if you are able to donate, then that would be really lovely. I'll link a couple brands that I believe are trustworthy in the video or in the description below. Just be aware that they come with their own criticisms as well. In our world, nothing is black and white, and there's always nuance. I've done my research on them, but I would encourage you to also take a look to make sure that your ethics align with theirs. And lastly, please, please, please engage with this video in any way, shape, or form. It would be so wonderful if you could help this video get a bunch of eyes on it to help spread awareness of the horrible living conditions that people in India and all over the world who are working on tea plantations face. I went into this video really excited and happy to share the history of tea with you because I really love tea and I enjoy it every day. But I didn't know that people's human rights were being violated because I wanted to drink a cup of tea. That's all I got for you.